Hello and welcome to this special webinar co-hosted by Innovation Forum, Forest Trends, Supply Chain Initiative and the Tropical Forest Alliance 2020. I'm Ian Welsh and my apologies for my slightly croaky voice. Today we are going to consider two new reports from Supply Chain and TFA 2020 that analyse corporate progress and track latest trends on deforestation commitments. Not much time remains in the timetable for deforestation commitments laid down by the likes of the Consumer Goods Forum, the New York Declaration on Forests, and We Mean Business. And while there is growing evidence that companies are setting goals to manage deforestation within their commodity supply chains, analysis shows that much remains to be done to increase the momentum towards the necessary transformational action. So, over the next 90 minutes, we're going to discuss the two new reports from TFA 2020 and Supply Chain and debate how leading companies are moving towards deforestation-free commodity supply chain. We will outline some of the new research's key conclusions and examine trends among corporate commitments to reduce deforestation from the big four agricultural commodities: palm, timber and pulp, soy, and cattle. So on the webinar today, to outline some of the most interesting conclusions from their new reports, we have Stephen Donofrio, Senior Advisor at Supply Chain, and Marco Albani, Director of TFA 2020. And to provide some expert context and commentary, we have Hannah Hislop, Senior Global Advocacy Manager with Unilever, Anita Neville, Vice President, Corporate Communications and Sustainability Relations with Golden-Agri Resources, and Katie McCoy, Head of Forests Programme with CDP. Unfortunately, Mario Napo from GBS is no longer able to join us. And my thanks to my colleague Boris Petrovic for leading from Innovation Forum's end, alongside Supply Chain and TFE 2020 for convening our panel and organising this webinar. The issues we're discussing today will also be covered at two upcoming events I want to bring to your attention. TFA 2020's General Assembly in Brasilia next week on March 20th to 22nd, and Innovation Forum's How Business Can Tackle Deforestation Conference in Washington, D.C. on April 3rd and 4th. More details are on your screen, including how to sign up now for the best price passes. So, back to today. I will shortly invite our panellists to make some opening remarks to kick things off, and we will have some follow-up discussion, and I will then open the debate up to audience questions in the second half of our time. We want to be as interactive as possible today, so please submit your questions using the comments box on the webinar dashboard, and I'll put them to our panel. Questions can be directed to all the panel or to one panelist in particular, and if you can keep your questions short, it is more likely that I will use them. We are recording the discussion, and we'll circulate this after the webinar. Okay, first of all, given that they are launching their new reports today, I would like to invite Stephen and Marco to give a very quick bit of snapshot context around their new research. Stephen, over to you first.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Ian, and thanks to everybody else for being on this call and webinar with us today. It's for us to launch this report alongside with TFA's launch of their 2016-2017 annual report. It's a really great opportunity to bring two new publications together that are tackling and addressing the same issues of deforestation-free commodities at the same time. And so there's quite a bit of overlap here, and that's what you'll see as part of this webinar. So thanks very much to Innovation Forum and TFA for working with us on putting this webinar together. Just before I begin and get into the report, I have to give a couple of quick thanks to our collaborators, WWF and CDP, and who had specific staff, Lizzie Schuler, Sandra Mulder, Katie McCoy, and Jillian Gladstone, who worked with us on this report. We pulled together data from a variety of different sources, but we do have a very good partnership with our collaborator CDP, who provides public CDP disclosures to the forest program to us, which we feed into our research and report process. We also have two donors, which are important to mention: the Global Environment Facility, United Nations Environment Program, both of them who are supporting Supply Chain in the production of this report. We have a great steering committee who are all listed up on our website, and also, importantly, it's to thank you, the audience, who are here with us today. The Supply Chain is an initiative of Forest Trends, which is a DC-based not-for-profit. the work that we do in supply chain may look simple on the surface, but it requires really a tremendous amount of wheel churning and research and coordination, much of which I tip my hat to Jonathan Leonard and Philip Rothrock, who are the co-authors of this report, and really the ones that in tandem are researching and aggregated this already available corporate data to create the profiles and to help us feed into the analysis of this report. So we do provide corporate profiles and content free to use and download on the website, supply-change.org, also in reports like this. And so if you go to that website now, you will see a pop-up that's soon to be updated, but there's a link there that indicates where you can download the report. And once you click on that link, it'll bring you to a holding page where that report is now available for download. So the 2017 report is officially live and in the public domain. Just to give a quick high-level overview of what this report will include, it has a general discussion around the state of corporate commitments. We've grown the number of companies in our database, and so as we do that, and as we see companies are continuing to pursue and set deforestation-free goals for their supply chains, we've updated our findings that you might typically see in our reports. What we have done that's new this year is that we've provided the first year-on-year comparison of commitments. We've included elements that we call dormant commitments, which are essentially as companies are reporting progress, which is great. There are companies that are not reporting progress, and there are commitments that are not being reported on. And so we've included a discussion about that. We've compared companies that have commitments, companies that do not, and we've also looked at some of the leading organizations and initiatives that companies are signing on to as members or participating in different working groups to understand how they're helping these companies along the way and how those collaborative initiatives are helping to create these deforestation-free supply chains. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Ian, or over to Marco, and just want to thank everybody so much for your time to join us for this launch of the report today and for the discussion that will follow.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, Marco, turning to you. Now, if you can give a very quick snapshot context around your latest bit of research and your new annual report.
Absolutely. But first of all, maybe it's important to say this is not our annual report is not a research report, right? This is basically, it's a report that provides an update of the activity of the TFA 2020, which is an alliance now comprising about 90 organizations from governments to NGOs to corporates that are working towards deforestation-free supply chains. But as we do this, as we report on the progress that we have made, I think there are three interesting pieces in it that actually are worth having a look at and spending some time on, and beyond, obviously, the partners and the founders of the TFA. First of all, we're reporting and connecting to the work we supported with the New York Declaration for Forest Go-To Assessment, which is something we helped support when it was done in the second half of last year. It came out and was launched as a full report. Goal 2 is the one that is set against commodity-driven deforestation. It was launched in Marrakesh at the UNFCCC conference of the parties, and we have done some additional work on it with the collaboration of Forest Trends and CDP and others in supply chain to actually look at how TFA 2020 and New York Declaration on Forest signatories are actually comparing in how they're making progress on their commitments. So that's very much a companion piece to the report of supply chain. There are two other pieces of content that are different and complementary. One is an assessment of the state of jurisdictional approach to sustainability. This is something we talk a lot about recently as a way to complement supply chain-driven approach to driving sustainability. And so we commissioned some research to look at the state, building on work that was already done by WWF and looking at the number of jurisdictions that are actually relevant to the commodities of interest for us, the big four. And the report found that actually there's a large number of jurisdictions that have made commitments and embarked on jurisdictional sustainability programs in the land use sector that are actually quite relevant to these commodities. And actually, if all these jurisdictions were to reach a deforestation-free or zero deforestation development path, this would actually cover double-digit percentage of the supplies of these commodities. It varies between commodities, but it's actually substantial. It's comparable in size of the impact that so far the certification movement has had in bringing the certain portion of the global trade of this commodity to being sustainable. So clearly this jurisdictional movement is quite important, is quite relevant, it's quite meaningful. Also, many of these jurisdictions are now reasonably advanced in their program. They're not just making statements, but they're actually moving to turn these statements into actual plans and moving to implement these plans. We had deep dives on specific jurisdictions, on Mato Grosso, on Pará, on Liberia, on Sabah and East Kalimantan that you can look at. And finally, I think something that will be very interesting, and it's a living piece that will continue to grow, is the mapping of the initiatives of TFA 2020 partners. So for last year, when we did our annual report, we mostly spoke about what we're doing as an alliance. And you'll find that, our 6 priority initiatives, what we're doing there, how the alliance is growing, what the Secretariat is doing, and so on and so forth. But now we're starting to actually be able to showcase what our partners are doing individually or in groups in a way that wasn't possible before. And so while so far a lot of the spotlight in this movement for deforestation-free commodities has been about commitments. And I think we're translating the spotlights from commitment to action. And here we're looking at really specifically at what actions people are taking. And so I think that's going to be quite interesting as a tool to create opportunities to engage in specific regions, in specific areas, on specific commodities, and work together with the partners of the TFA. And with that, get back to you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Marco. Okay, we're now going to frame our discussion around 4 broad themes. I'll introduce each theme and then invite Stephen and Marco to outline briefly the findings from the new reports that are relevant for each. Once Stephen and Marco have made their remarks for each theme, I will invite our panelists to make comments of their own on how they are seeing progress from their perspective and the business's perspective around these themes. So our first theme is that time is running out. Everyone agrees that time is running out for companies to firstly meet their 2020 commitments and more generally to save the forests and lower the risks of real environmental crisis from climate change. So what are the key steps that companies and their stakeholders must make now to get back on track? And why must companies not let commitments go dormant? Stephen.
Thanks, Ian. I'll try to keep this very brief because I do want to get the reflections of the speakers in line. But what's important for me to put up front is that as of our research cutoff date, which was December 1st of 2016, we found that there are about 718 companies. There are certainly more, but that the ones in our research, that there are 718 companies up and down the value chain that are dependent and exposed to the different commodities of palm, pulp and timber, cattle, and soy. This is up 25% from the 566 companies that we analyzed in the 2016 report. And so when you kind of look at that group of companies, you have to break it out into 2 different categories. And one is those companies that have made commitments. And so the ones that of those companies that have made commitments, there's 447 of them, and they've made a total of 760 different commitments to reducing their deforestation impacts. Again, that is up from 366 companies last year and 579 commitments. But really the important part about that is that many of these commitments have time-bound targets. And as we look at 2020, as that year is inching closer and closer, companies are increasingly not including a time-bound nature to their target. And then on the flip side of this is that Yes, I mean, this is relevant for companies that have a commitment, but it's also relevant for those companies that we've found that do not have a commitment, but that should. And so last year we saw 200 companies that should have a commitment, but do not, or they've not been public about it. And this year that's increased to 271 companies. So really, the longer that these companies wait to jump into the commitment pool per se is that the hill will be a lot steeper for them to climb when they finally do join into the pack and set those time-bound targets. So what is sort of the opportunity for companies, and how are we seeing that there's been progress being made? I mean, we have a section in the report that talks about collective action and working collaboratively with different organizations, and TFA is one example of that. But there's this sort of amplifying drumbeat of all different stakeholders that are really asking for more information about what does this translate to on the ground. And as what we're doing is collecting data from what companies are already reporting, we've been able to find 10 new policies that companies are putting into their reports and their websites and disclosures that really tackle more the production level side of the impacts of deforestation. So I'll talk about that a bit more later, but we provided some analysis on those different policies in the report. And then I guess the final two pieces here I wanted to talk about is that there's this continuum of commitments when we're moving towards implementation. And we've seen a strong increase in the number of commitments that have reporting for this control group that we've identified, and I'll explain that more later, but that there's a 57% growth in progress reporting for this control group. And that's really encouraging to see, because we need to have more information about what is the state of these commitments from those companies that have made them. And that's, again, one reason why the partnership with CDP is so important. I mean, generally, we need standardized, globally recognized mechanisms and systems or protocols to have for companies to be able to report information. And we have some findings that show the difference between quantifiable types of commitments, for example, certification, versus the more broad or less prescriptive commitments that don't have standard methodologies. And so we need to understand that there are differences there in the types of commitments that companies are making. And then finally, and I'll talk about this in more detail later, but we mentioned this concept of dormant commitments in the report. And what that really means is that companies and their commitments that they are reporting, while we're seeing that there's progress, as I mentioned earlier, that there's still a significant number of companies that aren't reporting frequent progress to be able to inform their stakeholders on where they are. So these are kind of bundling these all together. It really drills down to the need for transparent and frequent information from companies, more details about not just their commitments, but what is the implementation side of that, and how is it actually impacting things on the ground, and what are the right metrics that we can track for the variety of different commitments that are out there. So back to you, Marco.
No, thank you. Thanks so much, Stephen. So, Marco, can you perhaps outline from your perspective then, from your annual report, your thoughts around, is time running out, and what must companies do to get back on track right now?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that the time is the clock is ticking, and we have a short time if we want to meet the aspirational goal of 2020 and deforestation. And the interesting thing is that if we think about what happened in the SDGs, is that actually the goal became even more ambitious, because the Sustainable Development Goals actually include ending all deforestation by 2020. So time is really running out, not just commodity-driven one. But what Stephen mentioned is clearly very important: enhancing disclosure, promoting transparent supply chains. In the other areas is collaboration and partnership. As the availability of sustainably produced commodities for companies to bring in their supply chains going to be fundamentally then driven by policy decisions that are made in the producing companies, in the producing countries, and by choices that are made by producers, small producers, mid-sized producers, large producers. Now, those producers have fewer degrees of freedom than the consumer-facing companies have. If they have a land bank, they don't have a choice to necessarily develop another land bank. So there's a real push for an agenda of sustainable intensification, sustainable land use choices that needs to happen, and we need to come around. And needs to be specific. So we have some cross-cutting elements. And if you go to our report, towards the end, we start to lay out what could be an initial agenda to get to 20. Expert opinion discussion on the back of the NYDF goal to assessment report, and we're starting to discuss, and we'll discuss next week in Brasilia, to see if we can get to something that really we can get a whole ecosystem of this movement for deforestation-free supply chain behind. It's an agenda that is necessarily articulated. It needs to look at the main commodities. It needs to look at the main regions. There are different options, different priority strategies in each one of these. There are some cross-cutting elements, and so maybe let me focus on the big cross-cutting one. There's a few that stand out to me. We have a few listed. There's actually several. I'm just going to pick on the ones I think are most important. One is the disclosure and the transparency in supply chains. This is what Stephen was talking about. This is critical. We need to know where stuff comes from. We need to be able to connect supply chains to deforestation and improve supply chains to actually drop in deforestation. We're still not able to do that very clearly. The second one is the whole jurisdictional movement. Not because everything will be done through jurisdictional sourcing, not because jurisdictional will solve all the issues we have, and not because we have to leave behind the supply chain, the approach, the certification approach, and move completely and tack completely to jurisdiction. But these jurisdictions are meaningful. They are really material. And that's where the integrated approach and is really needed. And that's where this agenda links to REDD+ agenda. So really scaling up, accelerating the process towards sustainable production at the jurisdictional level is quite critical. And then the last one I'll add, and there are more if you go to the report, but the last one I want to talk about in this specific one is bringing the transparency also in the financial sector. We need to move finance from deforesting and unsustainable agriculture practices to the non-deforesting and the sustainable agriculture practices. And to do that, we need the transparency also in the investment, also in the financial sector. This is very important. We need to get much more engagement from the financial sector in this space. We're starting to see that. And again, this is not starting from zero, and there's been a sustained engagement by some players. But over and over, we see in the reports, the supply chain report, the Forest 500 report, that the financial sector players are the one who are least engaged. They're not seeing quite yet why this is material to them. And I think that's a critical area of transparency that we need to work on.
Great. Thank you very much, Marco. I'd like to bring in our panelists now. Firstly, Hannah from Unilever. Hannah, Unilever obviously has been a leading company. It's made many commitments and made some good progress. But what are you doing internally to keep things on track, to keep the pace up, and to make sure that Unilever does make its commitments? Hannah.
Sure. Thanks, Ian and Stephen and everyone else, and really glad to be here. I think in terms of what Stephen was just saying around this kind of amplifying drumbeat of stakeholders, I mean, I think that is critically important in terms of keeping us to our commitments. It's always really helpful internally to be able to point to the very kind of wide diversity of stakeholders who are really keen to see us meet that target and supportive of the challenges that we're encountering in getting there. And I think I'd like to reflect a bit on Stephen's comments and some really interesting kind of data coming out of the supply chain report around this real focus on sort of what does this actually mean on the ground. So I think we're getting a bit more sophisticated in terms of what we're actually starting to measure and hold companies to, and in some ways that means being a bit less forgiving, because we actually we need to see action on the ground. It can't just be around meeting certification numbers if those actually aren't delivering the change that we need to see. But at the same time, I think it's actually a really positive incentive for companies to engage, because they can really be reassured that a more honest dialogue, combined with a bit of realism around the challenges, will turn into actually something quite productive. And that sort of speaks to the partnership and collaboration piece that Marco was talking to as well. But I think, in terms of how we're sort of shaping up towards 2020, we're still very much committed. And I think, particularly if you look at our palm oil work, we actually announced a more ambitious target last year. We refreshed our palm oil policy and actually brought the date of our 100% certified sourcing forward. And so I think, you can see that we're actually kind of really going forward with as much energy as we can, and really trying to work with a number of, with as many different stakeholders as we can to turn this into action on the ground that actually makes a difference.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Anita, I can turn to you now, and perhaps you give us some insight into what GAR is doing to keep up the pace of its commitments, and also perhaps you could reflect on how far off 2020 feels now for commitments-wise. Anita.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, everyone. I think this whole question of time running out is a really interesting one. 2020 is just around the corner, and obviously there are these very specific commitments that we face. But I'm reflecting increasingly in our own business how a sense of urgency is good, but a sense of desperation is less so. And how the noise that comes around with the pursuit of the target date of 2020 is increasingly negative in its construction. And I think that is also the case of how we constructed some of these commitments and policy frameworks in the first instance. One of the things that I think GAR got right when it developed the first forest conservation policy in palm oil in Indonesia and really in the sector was to frame a forest conservation policy as opposed to a no deforestation policy. And the reason that I think that's the right thing to do is it sets up a very different dynamic when we're going to communities, to other smallholders and suppliers in our supply chain, as well as in our own operations, where we frame a positive, how can we conserve this, as opposed to don't cut that down. And then when you frame that conversation in a more positive and constructive way, your chances of getting real engagement are much more likely. Many of these commitments were created by end users looking at the world in a very different way than it looks from the producer end, where we have to actually get this stuff done. And I think also done very much in the context of we have the technology to solve these problems, but the reality on the ground that we find in our supply chain work, for example, is that as much as there is technical expertise that we need to bring to bear to solve these problems, there is also cultural and behavioral change, sociological skill sets that are needed really to change the behavior in practical terms of the many players, certainly within palm oil. And I think that takes a different, it requires a different skill set, and also means you need to look at your timeframes in a slightly different way. Perhaps if we had front-loaded more of the work in the early stages of these commitments around transformative investments, which are really starting to pick up pace now, perhaps we would be further along or closer to hitting that 2020 milestone than it feels right at this moment.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you very much indeed. Katie, turning to you, in terms of where CDP is, what do you think in terms of, are you seeing commitments going dormant, as Stephen suggested, or do you see a kind of still a great, a sense of pace rather than desperation, as Anita suggested. Katie.
Thanks, Ian. I think it's a very interesting question, and one of the things that really struck me from the supply chain report, reading through and reviewing it around this question around dormancy of commitments, I think what we see at CDP is a high level of commitment from the companies that are disclosing to us in terms of the level of ambition is high. And I wouldn't want to discourage companies. I completely agree with Anita's comments around not scrambling around in desperation, but there's a fine balance to be had between being desperate and being ambitious. But where I would say that we see and having reviewing where commitments perhaps do go dormant or where they go missed is where perhaps a company hasn't thought about the interim milestones, or as Hannah spoke about the approach of Unilever, actually reviewing where you are at as a company with your target. At what stage did you think you were going to be when you set the commitment and the target? What stage are you now? Does it need to be readjusted? And I think while I encourage all companies to be ambitious with what they can achieve in a time-bound way, it is really essential to set those interim milestones and to be able to review and report and track the progress towards those, so that you know as a company where they need to be, in the following year or in 5 years' time. So I think that's something that we see more often than not in the leading companies, is that kind of interim milestone approach. And that tends to mean that those companies don't see their commitments go dormant in the timeframes that we're talking about.
Thank you very much indeed, Katie. Well, let's move on to our second theme. If first theme was that time is running out, our second theme is companies are reporting better and being more transparent. So a bit of a positive slant. So commitments are gaining momentum, and increasing numbers of companies are being open on what they need to do and how they need to go about it. Stephen, what did you find in your research in relation to this?
Yeah, thank you. And just a quick comment. I mean, that's a really good point about that Anita made about the 2020 goal and this urgency. But what we're trying to identify is how do we gauge the progress, and as we do that and try to do that without so much pushing on this 2020 timeline, that we can look at these indicators and try to understand what are the barometers that should be used to gauge that progress. So as I mentioned before, we found this increase, this growth in progress reporting for that control group of companies that had commitments in 2016 and also in 2017. So that's great. And with now 51% of those commitments having progress information. So that's a really positive thing. The reality is that a lot of these commitments are not the same, and they come in different shapes and sizes. I mentioned this previously, but some of them are more quantifiable, such as certification, whereas others are not, like zero deforestation. And then others are focusing on specific actions, such as traceability. And then even when you get into something like traceability, how far back up or how far up the supply chain is traceability going? But across the board, we found that companies in that control group are reporting more progress across all these different types of commitments from the previous year's report, so from our 2016 report. The quantifiable ones, as I mentioned, are easier to report on. I mean, certification had the greatest growth, about 66% from 2016. But interestingly and notable is that zero deforestation, while it does not have that universally accepted system of metrics, did see a 59% growth in reporting of progress. So it's left up to the companies in some ways to determine the way in which that they quantify and track their progress, and then be able to report that. And so we highlighted a few companies in the report, such as Danone and Walmart and Asia Pacific Resources, that reported 100% of progress towards their zero deforestation commitments for their respective work. But those additional elements that I mentioned previously, just to dive a little bit deeper into that for the context here, is that these are the policies that, even though they are addressing the social and environmental and wildlife impacts at the site of production, we're seeing these policies be mentioned not just from producers. And what's positive about that is when we see it in other parts of the value chain, that shows that there's alignment around the commitments that are being made and the policies that must be implemented in order to reach those end goals. And so as much as the supply chain can be aligned with itself, the more success it's likely to have in actually achieving those goals. And so just a couple of examples of those different policies is that the greatest one that we saw was 37% of all tracked commitments are now explicitly prioritizing the protection of biodiversity and wildlife. Others that we added in are things like reducing greenhouse gas emissions from operations, where we saw 35% of commitments, including a mention about that. And then also things like improving water management, whereas 29% of commitments had that policy mentioned. And then something that's a bit more cattle specific, but it's relevant because we added a significant number of new companies to our research list, and many of those were somehow related to the cattle sector. So we found that 63% of cattle commitments include policies for the ethical treatment of cattle and more sustainable use of land for when there's cattle expansion. And so all this is kind of summing up into this recognition that the progress reporting is potentially becoming more commonplace or more it's maybe easier to do as companies are achieving progress, and it's much easier to report progress when it's good information. It's not as easy to report that progress if the results aren't favorable for the company, but it's still valuable information to dig into. And as we can refine the right criteria for companies to report on and to really understand, again, going back to those impacts on the ground, then I think the better off we all will be, not just the companies, but stakeholders as well, to be able to really be informed about how companies are progressing on their commitments. Thanks. Back to you, Ian.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks very much indeed. Marco, from in your report, what evidence are you seeing for companies reporting better and being more transparent?
Well, from our point of view, that's actually not something we focus on too much on how to do it. I mean, clearly there's lots of opportunity, but I would defer to Steve on this. Frankly, this is not something we have specifically focused on. The ways to be more transparent.
But are you seeing the evidence of them their progress? Are you seeing them reporting it better? Is that something you generally are seeing?
Well, the NYDF Goal 2 report show that this is this important piece of the agenda, and that we see that they're focusing on it. But really, we use the data from Steve, so I don't really have a lot to add in this specific one.
Okay, sure. Well, thanks very much indeed. Let me turn to the panel. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to ask each member of the panel to comment on every theme. So perhaps Katie from CDP, if you could comment specifically on what you're seeing in terms of better reporting and transparency from companies.
Sure, absolutely. So we're seeing quite a lot of an increase. Well, every year we see more and more companies reporting. We were really pleased in 2016 to see that actually there was an increased number of really influential companies from across the value chain reporting. We had reporters such as GAR, such as ADM and Bunge, big trading companies, as well as new kind of branded companies such as Starbucks. So really seeing that momentum year on year is really encouraging. What I would say, though, and what we find as CDP was, quite disappointing, is that around 80% of the over 800 companies that we asked for information for on behalf of investors did not disclose. So it really does show that although we've got an encouraging upswing in the level of transparency on these issues, and quite rightly, we do have some excellent best practice examples, some work that is going on to implement these commitments in a meaningful way by some really leading companies, there is a big middle and below the middle underneath that, where we need to see more transparency and reporting on this issue, so that we can really gauge how much progress is actually being made. So while the picture is encouraging year on year, I'm not sure that it's where we need to be quite yet.
There's still a fair way to go. I think it's a fair assessment. Okay, well, let's move on to our third theme, which is that there's a broad spectrum of progress, which leads very nicely on from Gary just mentioned. There seem to be ever more distinct leaders, both in terms of individual companies and also sectors, that have made more progress towards deforestation-related commitments and putting them into practice. But while there are clear leaders, many companies are still not reporting on progress. Stephen, what does your new report highlight around this kind of spectrum, and I guess the leaders and laggards problem?
Yeah, I've said a good amount about this to kind of set the stage, and just make a few comments to follow up on the dormant commitments piece. I mean, clearly that progress reporting, and as Katie mentioned, I mean, it deserves recognition of those companies that are doing this. But there is a huge group of companies that are not being transparent and are not disclosing information into CDP, for example, or for just any public resources that for those 270 companies that we've identified, that we cannot build profiles for them on the website because we can't find information. And so that's an important, I think, starting point for this. And then as we start looking at this concept of dormant commitments, what we found by looking at the companies in our databases, 1 in 5 of the commitments, about 20% of all commitments, has become dormant, and that really means that there's not been an update on progress of that commitment. So what that's calling out is that it's one thing to make the commitment and put it into the public domain, and it's another thing to, in effect, hold yourself accountable to it by reporting and providing additional information to tell stakeholders where you are in achieving that commitment. And then in terms of the companies, we've found about 30% of companies, while companies may have more than one commitment, but we found that about 30% of companies have at least one dormant commitment in their commitment portfolio. And so that's another thing to look at, is that we should really understand, that companies have a lot of information to gather and track and report on. But does it ask the question of our companies selectively reporting, which commitments versus reporting on everything? Do reports come out at different times? Is information gathered at different intervals? But really, this is about demonstrating progress and appeasing stakeholder interests to assure them that the commitments are effectively live and well, and that they've not been placed aside. And unfortunately, a stakeholder's perception of a lack of information could lead to the worst case scenarios. And so companies that might have negative information to report, it's still better to report that and provide the rationale as to why potentially they did not make the mark, because it could still be very much better than what the presumption could be from a viewer looking in from the outside and not seeing anything. So, I guess in the positive side of all this, when looking at the progress reporting, the palm and pulp and timber commodity groups had the strongest increase in progress reporting. And that is potentially because of the more kind of mainstream and widespread proliferation of the certification programs for those commodities, such as RSPO and FSC and PEFC. But there's been a lot of strong effort from technical groups, such as the Palm Oil Innovation Group and the High Carbon Stock Group, that are working towards setting the right, standards and goals and actions for companies to take to have sustainable supply chains. But there's also potentially, it's worth looking at the fact that there are regulations in place, such as the U.S. Lacey Act and the European Union Timber Regulation, that come into play as companies have to adhere to policies. So the other commodities like soy and cattle did see growth, but just not as much. And as it's also worth pointing out that the majority of commitments that we see in our database do happen to be palm and pulp and timber. So I think that should kind of take care of this for now. Happy to answer questions, but that's what we're seeing in terms of progress or lack of progress information being reported.
Okay, thanks very much, Stephen. Let me turn to Marco. What are you seeing in terms of the increasing gap?
Again, we use the same data of Stephen, so we see exactly the same thing he's seeing. So our report is basically okay. If we look at the specific progress of corporate commitments, we're fundamentally working on the back of what supply chain change is doing. We did some additional interview. One of the things that we've seen that maybe it's important calling out is that the companies who are part of cooperation platforms like TFA 2020, like the NYDF signers, they seem to actually move faster. They seem to actually have better performance in how they have actually moved from commitment to action. That I think is the only thing to add from our work to what Stephen's been talking.
Okay, thanks very much. I'd like to bring in Hannah from Unilever. Hannah, from your perspective, on the other side of the fence, what do you see in terms of the gap between the leaders and the laggards? Perhaps just in a few sentences, please, as time is moving on. Hannah, what do you think?
Sure. Well, I mean, clearly there is still a significant gap between leading companies and those that haven't yet sort of got on board this journey. And I think, someone said earlier, obviously the longer you leave it, the harder it's going to be. And I think we could, we could very, very much verify that. We benefit from having this issue brought to our attention, pretty early on, and so we are now able to reap the benefits of quite a lot of years of working on this. So I guess I would just really encourage companies to just start as soon as possible, because it's definitely not as bad once you jump into the water.
Thank you very much. And Anita, is that a sentiment you'd share, that it's really worth pushing hard and keeping up that level of urgency that we talked about?
I think it's really important that you have aspiration and ambition, as Katie set out, and that you have those milestones to keep you going. But what I found really interesting looking at the supply chain report was this question as to why there is disproportionate progress, or this broad range of progress between leaders and laggards. And if I think about the palm oil sector, I think one of the reasons that we see laggards there are a multiplicity of them. Anything would be a generalization, really. But there is, I think, amongst some of the people watching the leaders, a fear of persecution. When you see leading companies like my own still getting hammered in the public domain for gaps that we still have to address in these quite ambitious policies, then I think people get scared about putting themselves above their heads above the parapet. And we have to really speak to the human aspect of this challenge. I also think in our own experience in moving through our supply chain mapping process there is a lack of meaningful capacity out there to get this stuff done. There is a lack of HCV licensed assessors. There are a lack of people who really understand how to do free, prior and informed consent with communities appropriately, and who can do that in a culturally appropriate way. We have very few of them here in Indonesia, for example. And so what I think is really needed now in order to accelerate the rate of change and to help us bring particularly the smaller players along with us to Marco's point, seeing better performance when people are part of a club, part of a gang, I get that. But many of those clubs and gangs are still elitist in the sense that there are big companies like ours who are around those tables. If we really want to lift the floor of these industries and bring everyone along with us, I think we need to see a significant investment of multi-stakeholder approach towards helping build the capacity in people's understanding of what we're asking them to do when we go to them and say, here's the GAR social and environmental policy. It commits you to no development on HCV, HCS forests. Here's how you decide what those ones are. And then here's how you go about, once you've identified them, here's how you go about negotiating with the communities that may live and work around them to protect them. And oh, by the way, we want you to keep them standing forever. So here's how you go about making sure that you're managing those values so they're not degraded in the long term, and therefore the value of that standing forest diminishes. There's a lot of layers to these, and we're not yet seeing the real significant investments in those ground level approaches to build capacity. We are starting to see the interest to support those programs from end users, from other parts of the supply chain. And I'm heartened by that, and I hope that it really does help us accelerate change.
Great. Thank you very much, Anita. Right, let's move on to our final theme, which is that effective collaboration at scale models are taking hold. The development of jurisdictional and landscape level approaches involving cooperation between government, indigenous peoples, companies, NGOs, and other stakeholders are providing proper solutions. Marco, I want to turn to you first. I know there's something that does feature in your annual report. Can you say us a little bit more about what sort of effective collaboration models you're seeing developing, and particularly jurisdictional level approach?
So there's a number of first of all, there's a number of interesting jurisdictional programs that are happening and that are government-led and government-driven with support from, and you have 5 in our report that are looked at in detail, but it's not just those 5. There are more. One experience that was very interesting, and it's also described and discussed in our report, is the Africa Palm Oil Initiative, where now we have 7 African countries in West and Central Africa having made commitments to develop the palm oil sector in a sustainable manner. And we're working with them as Tropical Forest Alliance to bring a number of stakeholders from the region, from producer companies to integrators, to buyers, to NGOs, and help turn those commitments, government commitments, into and government aspirations into implementation plans and into effective then implementation of those plans. And as was said before, that definitely there's capacity building that is a critical piece of that. And there's a lot of capacity building that is starting to get aligned with the development of sustainable supply chains, capacity building, potential support and technical assistance from donors. But that requires bridging fundamentally the big cultural gap that exists between traditional development assistance on one side, even the let's say the more modern version of it in the forest sector, the REDD+, the forest carbon version of it, and actual supply chains. And these are worlds that have to basically go through a transition, a cultural mediation in order to be able to talk to each other. There's an issue of trust that needs to be built, and there is an issue of culture on how to basically talk to each other, how to understand each other's priorities and each other's way of actually measuring progress. And this is something that is actually happening. And I think APOI, the Africa Palm Oil Initiative, is a good example on how that's been done. And there we had basically donors supporting a facilitating NGO that created multi-stakeholder groups in each one of the countries that are working together with the government to put together plans, and then really trying to figure out what are the entry points for the different potential private sector participants. And these are the companies who are developing the palm oil sector in the region as growers, but also the financiers that could be interested in especially building basically the smallholder or the small and medium-sized enterprise supply chain for these bigger growers. Because as long as we do everything through the traditional big plantation model, it's easy in one way because we have fewer players that we need to work with, but has huge limits in other dimensions of the development of the supply chain. And clearly, especially for the palm oil sector, there's a huge potential of using it as a development lever to get smallholder yields up. And this is true in Southeast Asia, but it's true in Africa, it's true in Latin America, and create actually an effective ladder out of poverty for farmers. But to do that in a way that actually also gives us good development from an environmental point of view is not easy at all. And so that's where I think that the multi-stakeholder approach is actually starting to show progress and promise. We just held about a month ago an investment dialogue, an implementation dialogue, for the Africa Palm Oil Initiative for the 3 countries that are moved the fastest on this journey, that are now working on their national action plans, on the implementation of their national action plans, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Liberia. But there's quite a lot of work that is needed in order to make the translation from the government position to the NGO way of looking at things, domestic NGO, international NGOs, and then to the way that different parts of the private sector can actually find their entry point and where they can actually play a role. And so I think as we move forward, we really need to be thoughtful about creating these spaces in which to do that, and do that in a way that is also economic in the use of time. The most limiting factor, I think, for many of these players, because we have limited capacity, and as Anita was saying, we do have limited capacity. There are very few people who actually fully understand, or if not fully, at least have a pretty decent understanding on what is needed and what needs to happen. And those people are heavily stretched. And so we need to create these opportunities in a way that is very effective in the use of time. And this is not specifically true for people like me, that are working in the developed world and have reasonable access to all sorts of support for travel, for information, and so on. But if we look, especially in the either in the rural regions of middle-income countries or in the least developed countries, the number of government officials that are actually able to engage effectively with this agenda, who are critical for this agenda to move forward, they are heavily taxed in their time. They just don't have enough time. And we all call on them to come and join us in workshop and join us in sessions and so on. And it's critical because we can't just talk to each other, right? So there's a bunch of people living in the north and talking about this problem. That's absolutely not the right thing. But we also have to be very effective with the use of their time. So I think that the multi-stakeholder platform building is critical. It needs to drop down. It needs to be effectively done in regions so that it's actually accessible to local stakeholders, is accessible to local government, because that's what's actually going to make a difference.
Thank you very much, Marco. Stephen, turn to you. Just very quickly, what are you seeing in terms of the growth and development of these collaboration at scale models that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I don't want to detract too much from what Marco just said, because everything that he's mentioned there is incredibly important. But I just want to make a couple of quick comments. I mean, TFA is a great example of how externally collaborating can really help not only set company commitments and create these individual ambitions, but it can really help to build the infrastructure for what is needed to not only to go beyond the individual commitment and engage, not just with the corporate side, but also with government and other stakeholders that, when all together, are the puzzle that is needed to have effective policies and implementation strategies to go from a public goal to actually success on the ground. And so we, in this report, and I'll just call it out, I won't get into the details just now, but we looked at 15 different initiatives or stakeholder groups, what we call related activities. And so those could be, like TFA, but also reporting and disclosure bodies like CDP and certification programs, industry groups like Consumer Goods Forum, but also commitment platforms like the New York Declaration on Forests, Canopy Pledge, and We Mean Business. And when looking at those, it's really in the details that's important to try to assess, the function and the opportunity, the function of those activities and the opportunity that a company would have, or the benefits the company would have as a result of participating in them. And the oversight or the direct relationship that activity will have with the company is really important to understand. And what are the goals, or what are the mandates that they are establishing for companies to adhere to? And I mentioned before the Palm Oil Innovation Group and others that are very prescriptive about what the company needs to be doing in order to be a part of that group. And then there are other types of initiatives like the Consumer Goods Forum, which has the Zero Net Deforestation Board resolution. And that is, again, that type of a goal is a little bit more difficult to track and report, but we did see some strong progress there. And so it sort of drives home the point that these difficult types of commitments do benefit from, companies do benefit when they establish them for being a part of a collective group that can help them engage with their peers and learn from them, utilize technologies collectively, engage with the same suppliers or parts of the value chain. So I would leave it there, but just to say that these multi-stakeholder or various different initiatives that are bringing together the different actors that are all required to be talking together to really make zero deforestation or other types of deforestation-related commitments to happen, it is really important, and TFA is a great example of that.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephen. I want to now turn to our questions that have been coming in from our audience. Thank you very much indeed. There's been a lot of questions coming in, so we'll spend the rest of our time addressing those. The first thing I want to address is going back to the dormant commitments issue. Our questioner points out that 1 in 5 commitments are dormant, which is a kind of fairly shocking statistic. So what can we do to have better accountability on these commitments and companies being held account to their commitments? I want to turn to our panel first on this. So Hannah from Unilever, what's your view on that? It is pretty shocking, isn't it? 1 in 5 commitments dormant.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it does that sound like a large headline number. I'd love to know a bit more detail, about in terms of, were the characteristics of that group of commitments that we can look at. Are they generally in a particular commodity or a particular part of the supply chain? I guess what are the circumstances in which companies make a commitment and then sort of abandon or ignore it? I mean, I guess. I'm not defending dormant commitments, but I think there is a bit of I definitely feel that, as Unilever, we have commitments across all 4 of the big 4 commodities, but palm oil is very much the one that we focus on. It's mainly because it's the one where we have the most leverage. We represent a significant chunk of the market, even though that's still very, very small in the global sense. And so it's really there what we find we can really use our kind of procurement muscle to influence the supply chains and to really try and shift the market onto a more sustainable footing. Whereas in other areas, it's obviously a lot harder for us. And so I think, that maybe stakeholders should probably have that awareness that if you ask a company to really lead on a particular issue and an area like palm oil, it's very difficult to kind of lead on all fronts at the same time. And so almost by definition, that can sometimes mean a lesser focus on other areas. So I think that's kind of a comment from my perspective. But I think just in terms of, stopping or reducing dormant commitments, I mean, I think, as I said earlier, being kind of having a kind of honest and open dialogue with stakeholders about why things are challenging, and writing that up, on your website or whatever, rather than just leaving it, is good. As is revisiting commitments. In some cases they may be increased in ambition. In other cases they might be made more realistic if there are unforeseen challenges. But I think as long as that's explained clearly, that is obviously going to be better than just sort of leaving it and hoping that no one really notices that nothing's happened in that area.
Thanks very much indeed. Anita, turning to you, what's your view on how to ensure that commitments don't get left behind? As Hannah said, when perhaps focusing on one particular thing, then other commitments aren't given the attention they deserve. But what's the secret to kind of maintaining a kind of pushing forward and everything? Is that possible?
I think that Hannah made a really good point that you kind of have to, in a way, it's like prioritizing what comes into your desk on any given day. There's the important and the urgent, and there's making sure that you don't just do the urgent, but you're also keeping the important ticking over. And some days you get that right, or at least I do it. Other days I really don't. The urgent just takes over. And it's a bit the same with this. I would really like to understand a little bit more, as Hannah said, what are these commitments, and are they sitting in a particular area? Because thinking about it from a GAR perspective, I think there are certain things that are easier to act on than others. So, for example, stopping bulldozers is a relatively easy thing to do, but resolving latent social conflicts can take months and years, and are more difficult to both report on in a even to do it meaningfully in a qualitative sense. I think we've sort of struggled to find what's the best way to represent progress in some of these things that, take a lot of process and a lot of conversation to move forward. So I think things move at different paces, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think Hannah's right. You've got to be able to communicate when things haven't moved as fast as you would like. I think that companies feel very nervous about admitting failure or admitting that things aren't moving as fast as you might like, because that also opens you up to criticism. So I think that's an issue that we need to address. But for us, it's really, we've had to pick some things that were both urgent and important, that lived in that quadrant, and move them on quickly. And then other things, we used the time that we were doing those things to figure out how we were going to do some of the things that were perhaps more challenging, like what is an appropriate FPIC model that we can roll out to supply chain, for example. That took more time to construct and figure out, and so it sits perhaps slightly behind things like stopping the bulldozers.
Sure. Thanks very much, Anita. I'd like to chuck this over to Stephen now. Perhaps you can tell us from your report. So, what are the commitments that are typically dormant, and what's your view on what should be done for greater accountability against those commitments, Stephen?
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. And these comments are right on in the sense where it may not be so straightforward as to how to report on a particular commitment. And, I've mentioned that a couple of times here, but, that's a challenge that whether or not companies have created that challenge, they're the ones that have to deal with it by not having clear guidelines for how to report. One thing that is fairly important for companies to do is to set essentially a baseline for when a particular commitment is announced of, this is what we're trying to achieve, and then be able to provide updates based on that. I mean, without getting too much into prescribing to companies what they should be doing or how they should be doing it. This is a fairly new piece of analysis that we've done, mostly just to try to understand in the universe of companies and commitments that we're tracking, how often are we not seeing updated information? And it would be great to dig deeper into this and to coordinate with some companies to provide that analysis about this is what we're typically finding, it's not being reported on, and to try to figure out based on that, or help them figure out with their stakeholders what are the best ways to do that. That's not necessarily our role to get too involved in creating the standards or the processes, but more just to track the information that's being put out into the public domain. So I'm not sure if I can provide much more detail on that at this time, but what is come up is really important, is that the quantifiable targets, or the quantifiable or very sort of systems, metrics based, that there's acceptance and understanding of how to report on them, then those are the ones that companies are able to report on and should be reporting on much more consistently. And then there are definitely commitments that are a little bit more challenging to provide specific details of progress, but even qualitative descriptions or details are helpful. So I'll leave it there and hand it back to you, Ian.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I think in the interest of time, I want to move to another question. Our questioner asks, interestingly, is it effective to chase up corporate commitments when they are all different? We talked about this earlier. And shouldn't we move more from talking about commitments to actually what the companies are doing throughout their supply chains? Or I guess turning it around the other way, are the commitments the only way for us to ensure that we know what they're doing in their supply chains? But Marco, I wonder what your thoughts on that were. So should we be moving away from looking at the commitments to actually thinking more about what the companies are actually doing in their supply chains, their behavior? Marco?
I think we need to do both. I don't see how one excludes the other. I think it's important the commitments are there because they provide an aspiration and an objective. And I think we've discussed in the previous conversation Dormant commitments and ways to make sure that we hold those who make commitments accountable for it. They're a moment of truth for the top of the organization generally, right? That's the way they're most effectively used, is to engage and make sure that the top of the organization signals that that's the way the organization wants to move. Then there's how do you actually make those commitments happen? So what are the practices that you need to have? And this is where the challenge is, because companies are different. They have different roles in the supply chain. They have different supply chains. And the way you change your policies to make these commitments happen is specific to geographies, to commodities, to supply chain position of the company. So you won't have a single model. And that's why it's important to understand what are they actually doing, and what are they actually doing that is positive. And again, I think that there's two things that we need not to lose track of. One is that we don't want to make the commitment choice something that you should be afraid of because it's going to bring additional scrutiny. And so this is maybe a plea to the more confrontational campaigning NGOs to actually do go after also those who don't make commitments and ask them why. Hold them accountable for not making those commitments, not making clear commitments. And commitments cannot be a way to greenwash or to defer a discussion that needs to happen, but they are a way to signal to the organization in which direction you want to go. And then good stories, examples, and so knowing what the companies are actually doing, both internally and for others to see as a best practices, then becomes extremely powerful. That's why we have, with TFA 2020, really invested a lot of time in the last 6 months in setting up this initiative mapping for our partners, so that the partners can know what other partners are doing. Because the reality is that there's not much transparency. Companies are doing interesting stuff. Often it goes through their PR channels and not necessarily coming through, and maybe is seen with some suspicion by other players. And so there is an important role for storytelling and connecting the positive things that are done. Because fundamentally, we need to move beyond the vision of sustainable supply chains as a boycott instrument. And that's how they start in a way, right? And there was a role and a time for that, of basically saying, well, you're destroying ecosystems, you're doing bad things, I will not buy your stuff. So you better clean up your supply chain. That kind of world view and that kind of approach has its role, but it's very problematic when it rolls up the supply chain and gets all the way up to producing countries where actually the people who are growing those commodities are actually doing that to lift themselves out of poverty. And so when you actually go all the way up the supply chain, you need to have an alternative. The alternative cannot be simply, well, just stay poor. That's not an option. That will not happen. And there will be others who will be willing to buy what you're not willing to buy if you're not actually offering a better development pathway, a better growth option, one that keeps the forest standing, but also allows people to lift themselves out of poverty, sends kids to school, sometimes for the first time, buy their first washing machine. You get all those comforts that people rightfully expect to have lives that are meaningful. And so that's where we need to know what companies are doing, and it has to be not just the naming and shaming of those who are doing bad things, which needs to happen, but it's also the naming and praising of those who are doing good things, or those who are really kind of figuring out an alternative development pathway. So I would really, really encourage us to actually make that part of the narrative, make that part of what we focus on, and that part of the activities of also all the people of goodwill that want to work on this agenda, because that's where we need to drive investment. That's where we need to drive attention and focus is towards these alternatives.
Sure. Well, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to move to another question, which moves actually on from that point. And our questioner asks, will the commodity progress we've seen in the big four spin over into other supply chains? Katie from CDP, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. What progress do you think we're going to see in other supply chains as we draw on the progress that the big four has made?
I mean, I think we've still got a long way to go with the big four. So I wouldn't want to say they were done and dusted as a first important point to say that that's clearly something that isn't going to go away, and we've still got a long way to go there. I'd say that as companies review their exposure to deforestation and other environmental and social risks, they themselves will draw up a plan of action, a set of commitments and targets related to whatever commodities are particularly relevant and material to their business. So there will be, other companies, I'm sure Hannah from Unilever would comment on her company's approach to looking at their priority commodities. And I think as companies become more aware and more involved and leading on these issues, they may and are starting to expand the approach, looking at other commodities. But I would argue that there's still a long way to go with the big four, as they're so called. Not to say that there aren't important drivers of deforestation in other commodity supply chains.
Thanks so much indeed. I do want to ask if there's any questions possible, so I'll move on to the next question, which I think is a great one. What impact can investors and shareholders have in holding companies to account against these commitments on deforestation? Let's put that one back to you, Stephen. The impact of investors and shareholders. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, you know what? Just because Marco had mentioned this a couple of times in his remarks in the opening, I might let him kick this conversation off, and I'd be happy to add in afterwards.
Okay, Marco, over to you. Stephen's throwing the ball to you.
Okay, so I think there are layers here, right? And I think we got to look at different companies and different investors and different shareholders. Clearly, shareholders can exert the rights on the the decisions to basically select the senior management of the company. At some point, they can actually play that. I'm not sure, and this is maybe more something that Katie and CDP has a better sense of, like to what extent and shareholders and investors and especially the big institutional investors who hold that shares are willing to back leaders to actually make the right choices and move away from leaders who don't. So at the end of the day, we have senior management, which is then accountable for what the decisions that companies make. But the reality is that a lot of what happens at the coalface, at the forest frontier, is not actually done by publicly traded companies. These are not publicly traded companies that multinational corporations with institutional investors behind them and CEOs that you see on the world stage, or much smaller companies or parts of conglomerates that actually that are part of the supply chain of other companies. And there are others that are trying to do the right things, right? So there is a role for investors in the financial sector to push for clarity and transparency in what is being funded and financed, what is being funded and financed by banks, what is being funded and financed by supply chain players. Because a lot of the finance that actually goes into the small players is actually also flowing through supply chain companies. And some are not the supply chain companies we tend to think of. They're more value chain companies. So this could be, for example, input providers or machinery providers. So do you know where your funding is going? Do you know where your financing is going? What is it actually funding and financing? And then I think there is the opportunity to push for investors to be more to be more courageous about backing sustainable investments. And of course, if you talk about this with pension fund managers, they'll tell you that pension funds are not something that is there to be gambled, and rightly so, right? That those funds are invested so that pensioners can receive their pensions. But there is a possibility to think about how do we actually do this? How do we take a little bit more risk? Or how do we actually explore the way in which public capital that currently is deployed in many ways and is starting to be deployed as a risk mitigation? For example, we have this new fund that was announced in Davos by the Norwegian government. How do we use that to actually make investments that are in an acceptable risk-return profile and actually have positive impact on the environment and our rural development? That, I think, is where we can go and where we need to go and where we need to put some pressure. Pressure and support, frankly, because it's also about supporting those who are doing the right things. I really want to stress this, that a lot of the role that public opinion, that campaigning organizations need to have, it's also supporting those who are actually willing to do the right things. Because it's very difficult to actually make change in an environment where there's only downside, where you basically, you're fundamentally punished for doing the wrong things, but you're not rewarded for doing the right ones. Then what's going to happen is that everybody's just going to do as little as possible.
Sure. Okay, well, thanks very much indeed. Kate, let's turn to you then and just take up that point. What can investors and shareholders do that perhaps to support companies in their achieving their commitments? Moving on from Marco's point, Katie from CDP.
Hi, yeah, I think it could be, depending on what kind of investor you are or depend on what kind of approach you're taking. But I mean, broadly speaking, the financial institution community can be, setting their own policies and standards for who they will and will not do business with. We're starting to see some financial institutions moving on that, but arguably nowhere near enough or as many as we see in the corporate sector. And, analysis by groups like Global Canopy Program on their Forest 500 of assessments of financial institution policies show there's still a long way to go there. So I think kind of on the basic level, that's something that a financial institution can do so that they are sort of, being able to have a policy that they can adhere to, that they can be held accountable to as well. It depends, whether many investors want to be able to engage with companies. Some are about divestment, some are about engagement, some are around, lending. So banks, Marco's quite right that a lot of the big companies that, are key players in a number of these supply chains are privately family-owned companies, but arguably, if you're a bank and you're lending money to companies, there's another approach you can take. So I think we should also start moving away from talking about investors and financial institutions as one block, because there's probably different avenues depending on the kind of financial institution they are. But
I think we lost Katie. Actually, I do have my next question is for Anita. What would you like to see your customers do to support GAR to meet the commitments being made, and how should the behaviour of downstream companies change in your view?
The one thing that we're starting to talk to customers about is how we can more strongly connect them to their supply chain, which is, of course, our supply chain as well, and help us invest in the transformation needed, particularly with smallholders and with small and medium companies in our supply chain, where we have the capacity issues that Marco and I have talked about this evening, to really change the way the industry is able to respond to these expectations of the international community in a more appropriate way. And then I didn't quite get the second half of your question.
Sorry, it was, how do you want to see the behaviour of downstream companies changing?
So I think, dare I say it, both as producers and traders, manufacturers and end users, we've all been part of this this legacy of deforestation. We've all profited from it over decades of behavior. And so we all have to contribute to the changing of that behavior. And that can't be just pushed down to producers. It's one thing to say to a company like GAR, fix the problem. And we have a responsibility, absolutely we do, to fix the problem. But when we do that as well to smallholders and small and medium companies in developing countries where there are issues of infrastructure, issues of education, issues of understanding expectation, then I think we need to help them make that transition. And I think it's incumbent on everybody in the supply chain to play their part in helping. We've tried to do that through certification and through premium pricing. I've worked in a lot of those systems. I'm not sure they're absolutely the right answer, but I do think direct investments in transformative projects, the kind of thing that Unilever is investing in now and others, is a better way to go. Over the last week, I keep running into the same quote, the same saying, which is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go further, go together. And I think if nothing else, that's the message of this webinar, is we need to be in it together.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We're coming to the end of our time. Apologies for the brief hiatus there. We had a technical problem. It seemed a couple of phone lines seemed to drop at the same time, but we're now back. Let me ask all our panel one final question, and it really is a central question that we asked ourselves at the beginning of the day. And that is, are companies going to meet their supply chain commitments? And to add a little bit to that, I want one thing from every panelist the companies should do to make it more likely they will achieve them. Anita, I'll come back to you. Are companies going to make their supply chain commitments? And what's one thing that needs to be done to help them move towards it?
I think the pragmatist in me says by 2020, it'll be quite the reach. So possibly no. But speaking for GAR, we're going to give it a red hot go. And what is the one thing that we need to do? We need to be able to frame this conversation, this whole conversation, more positively. It's really difficult to move suppliers along with us when they're operating in a spirit of fear and negativity. And I understand the frustrations out there. I've worked in the environment movement for a long time. But I do think we need to change the narrative to what do we want to do instead of framing it in the negative.
Thank you very much. Great point. Hannah, I'll turn to you now. What do you think? Will companies make their supply chain commitments, and what's one thing they need to do more to move towards it?
Can I just check that you can hear me, because
Yes,
I just switched to computer audio.
Yep, thank you.
Great, okay. On the first question, I think we'll see real progress by 2020, and I think we'll also have built the foundations for a more sort of transformational approach into the future. I think in terms of one thing, I didn't really get a chance to talk about Unilever's interest in jurisdictional and landscape approaches, but just very briefly, it's something that we're really interested in exploring. You know, it seems to us that rather than just an activity that can help us de-risk our own supply chain, this is something that can actually really move the needle, you know, on the ground, like we were talking about at the beginning, in locations where we have some priority commodities, and I think we would really like to see a handful of jurisdictional approaches in partnership with, you know, governments, subnational governments, other off-takers of commodities, indigenous people and their representatives, other NGOs, and, you know, people who can help us with targeted targeted finance to scale up some of the things that we need to happen in those jurisdictions. I think we'd really like to see a handful of those partnerships going forward really fast.
Thanks very much indeed, Hannah. Can I turn to Katie? Katie, are you back on the line? I see you are. Katie, can you perhaps you can give us your thoughts on will companies meet their commitments, and what's the one thing they should do better to get towards them? Katie.
Hi, I think that to keep it brief, I think companies need to continue making gains where they can, working in collaboration. But equally, I think we need to recognise that companies aren't operating in a vacuum, that there is an external enabling environment that needs to go along with it. So keep encouraging groups like the TFA, which really brings together those necessary other actors in the public sector and the civil society sector, so that we can really progress and make these commitments a reality.
Thanks so much indeed. And turning now to Marco and Stephen. Marco, you first. Are companies going to make their 2020 commitments on deforestation, and is there one thing they can be doing more to achieve them?
Well, I think that some will get close, some will not get that close. But I mean, that's probably also not the right question. And then the right question is, will we actually make progress in reducing and eventually ending deforestation? And I realize I'm not trying to shift the attention away from companies' commitments, but companies' commitments are a tool. They are a tool in the objective of ending deforestation, which is necessary now for us to meet the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. And those are the real goals, the ones we really want to achieve. Because we can have a space in a world in which, you know, all the companies who have made their 2020 zero deforestation commitment meet their commitments, and we still have lots of deforestation, and we have just bifurcated the market, and now we have a new set of companies who are deforesting and serving markets who don't care about deforestation. And that would be a tragedy, right? We would have actually not achieved anything. So I think the focus here is indeed on the enabling environment, is indeed in changing the narrative from one of negativity, one of positivity, to one of a positive development pathway. And so the most important question is, how do we make these commitments part of a positive narrative for forest frontier communities to actually have a different development pathway? And how do we make sure that the way the company meet their commitment is to actually helping jurisdiction embark and proceed and on that pathway? Because if the way we meet the commitment is by simply bifurcating the markets, we will lose. If we look at the big four commodities, bulk of production does not go into OECD markets. That's not where the majority of production goes. And so if these commitments don't become the catalyst for a different for a different way of developing in the forest frontier, we will actually have lost a huge opportunity.
Thank you, Marco. Stephen, turn to you finally then. Our central question, are companies going to make their supply chain commitments? And what's the one thing that they should be doing better?
Yeah, and that question definitely could deserve its own webinar that specifically just focused on responding to that question in particular. But I mean, the things that we've brought to the forefront in the report are essentially those indicators. So there's the engagement that companies can have in other and different groups and activities where they can work collaboratively and engage through a strong channel to governments and to other companies to getting to that end goal. And so looking at that as one example, but also having a better detailed understanding of what these commitments are and what are the right, I guess, criteria for companies to be setting so that they can establish a commitment that makes sense. And so looking at that 2020 goalpost, it is important to ask that question of, will companies be able to hit that, with the follow-up question of, if they're not able to hit their absolute end goal, then what is the progress that as stakeholders and as companies we would like to see that actually shows that there's been demonstrative progress been made, that shows that there's commitment to the commitment, and then effectively that getting to the end goal of ending deforestation within these commodity value chains. And so I think that's kind of the question that has to start emerging is what are the indicators of that progress, that when we get to 2020 and we see that, yes, some companies have hit the mark, but other companies have not, what is it that we need to be able to see that actually shows that the pathway has been, that the pathway is there and companies are on it? Because the reality is that these are not easy commitments to implement and require reformulation of commodity value chains, reformulation of business structures and models, reformulation of government policies. And much of that does not happen overnight, but hopefully, by integrating more deeply into government processes like the United Nations Framework on Climate Change and into NDCs and other things like this can help aid in the same way that landscape and jurisdictional approaches that Marco mentioned before, and in addition to all the other criteria indicators that we look at and commitments to show that there's activity happening on the ground and implementation is being seen.
Stephen, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We are going to have to stop the discussion as we are run out of time. I would like to thank our panel very much for their time and insight. But once again, if you'd like to continue the debate on business and deforestation, then please do join Innovation Forum in DC next month, or get to Brasilia next week for TFA 2020's General Assembly. We'll send you a recording of this webinar so you can listen again at your leisure and share with your colleagues. We always welcome feedback, so please don't hesitate to contact any of us at Innovation Forum with follow-up questions and comments. Thank you for all your questions during our last 90 minutes. I hope you found the webinar interesting, and thank you very much for listening.